we're excited to be hosting this webcast to share with you some of the insights and highlights from the CEO test, published by Harvard Business Press and written by two of our colleagues here at Merrick, Adam Bryant and Kevin Sharer. And for those of you who don't know, I think many of you know one or both. Adam has interviewed more than 600 CEOs about their kind of key leadership lessons, both during his time as a journalist and in consulting. And he teamed up with Kevin, who led Amgen's pretty remarkable growth over a 20-year period as president and then CEO before stepping into the next chapter of his life, both as a Harvard Business School professor and as a board member and a mentor to CEOs. So to guide this discussion, we've asked, and she's graciously agreed, we've asked another of our colleagues, Debbie James, to interview them and moderate a Q&A with questions you all had submitted prior to today. In case you don't know, Debbie has deep leadership experience and board experience herself, both in the private and public sector. And she's perhaps best known as the 23rd Secretary of the US Air Force. So she's also the author of her own leadership book, Aim High, which I've seen her present on 2 different groups, and it's a fantastic journey in and of itself. So with that, I'll leave you in Debbie's capable hands, and over to you.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, David. And hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about this fantastic book, The CEO Test, which, by the way, I have read cover to cover. So I say that very sincerely. I thought it was terrific. There's all kinds of lessons learned that I've already started to apply for myself, as well as in some of my relationships. So we're going to dive into this today. I have some questions. As you heard, we'll also take questions that have been submitted by all of you later on. But before we get into all of that, if you'll permit me, I want to channel my own inner Oprah a little bit and pick at a little bit the relationship between these 2 guys, Adam Bryant and Kevin Sharer. So guys, before we talk about the book, let's just talk about your backstory. How exactly did you guys meet, and how did this whole project really come about?
Well, thanks, Debbie. It's great to be here. And Adam and I first met when he started his corner office column. I think I was one of the early interviewees when I was in the job at Amgen, and I had been interviewed by a lot of people, but nobody who had as sharp and smart a set of questions as Adam. And when he did write the interview, it was a good one. And then after that, I spent some time at Harvard Business School teaching, thinking about this job, being a board member, and in a completely serendipitous way, somebody that we both know brought him to a cup of coffee that person and I were to have. And I said, "Hey, Adam, what are you doing?" And I said, "We ought to have breakfast." And I was very cheeky. He'd written books, I'd written nothing. And so I said, "Hey, let's write a book together." And Adam, to his credit, said, "Well, what's the topic?" And I said, "Maybe how do you actually do this CEO job?" And so we went on from there, and we formed over a 2-year period. It is hard to write a book, I'll tell you. It takes a lot of effort. Over a 2-year period, we have become really good friends, and I think we made a great team. And Adam's got his own version of this story, but for me, he gave me just an enormous gift. I could not have had a better partner. He was and still is a great editor. He's got lots of insights himself. It turned out to be wonderful, beyond my imagination, actually. So I'm deeply grateful to him.
And amen to all that. I'll just add, I mean, it's always a risk when you sign up to co-author a book with somebody. It's kind of like getting married with somebody you've barely dated, right? And you don't necessarily know how well it's going to go. But I think part of the beauty of the partnership is, like, we tried to create in sort of the metaphorical T, the breadth of my 600 plus interviews and all the stories and insights I've heard, with just the incredible depth of Kevin's experience. And I'll also say, I mean, we had a lot of sort of vigorous debates. There was a lot of time spent in front of a whiteboard, and the beauty of it is just we checked our egos at the door. I mean, we didn't always see eye to eye, but we worked through the issues, and ultimately, the insights that won were based on the merits, not arm wrestling. So it was a great partnership.
Now, of course, there's many, many leadership books out on the market today, and people have lots and lots of choices. So what would you say really sets this particular book apart?
I think, partly it's what Kevin and I bring to the table, point one, but I also think it's very the incredibly specific frame that we put on this book. We worked really hard to refine the questions that we wanted to ask and answer. And one of those is captured in the subtitle of the book. Well, what are the challenges that make or break all leaders? And even though the book is called the CEO test, it's not just for CEOs, of course. In some ways, we flipped the lens. A lot of people study CEOs as if they were a subspecies of the human race. It's a sort of special breed of people. And we kind of flip that script and say, well, in what ways is a CEO's job similar to the leadership challenges of somebody running a team of 10 people? And once you look through it through that frame, then you say, okay, so what are the challenges that all leaders face, ... And then how do you do it well? Just to sort of add that very practical playbook of this is how you do it. The book isn't about sort of theoretical discussions or academic treatises or philosophical discussions on what is leadership. It's like how to do this.
Yeah, I would just briefly add, Debbie, that what we tried to do was bring real practical advice to the field. There've been a lot of books written by a lot of thoughtful people on what makes a leader, what are the big ideas you have to have. And we kind of just went to how do you do the job? It's Monday morning, how do you do it? And we tried to do it in a way that was accessible to all leaders, and it was direct. It's clear. And there's also very practical examples and advice how to do it. So the big idea is this book is a practical guide for leaders. How do you do the job?
The other thing I really enjoyed about the book was the storytelling. You also have facts and statistics and whatnot. That's important too, but I think people just really resonate more with stories about how things are done well, or alternatively, how things fail because they're not done well, but how you bounce back. And the other thing I really loved about it was I'm a big list maker, and I'm sure there's others out there like me. And you ended up distilling a very big topic down to 7 key challenges. Can you talk a little bit more about the winnowing process? How did you come to these particular 7?
Well, Debbie, you're right. We could have had 27, I suppose. I think the first thing we decided was let's not talk about the personal characteristics required of a CEO, integrity, intellect, resilience, et cetera. Let's take those as kind of table stakes. And so we push those aside. Next thing we didn't talk about was style, because there's all kinds of different styles. And we also decided to not have topics that would be only applicable to CEOs or mostly applicable to CEOs, like how do you manage the board, or how do you organize and conduct product development? How do you work with investors? Those kind of very, very specific CEO things. And we said, let's take those 7 things that are most highly illustrated in the CEO job, but also apply to others. So the topics sound pretty simple. How do you listen? Hey, everybody knows how to listen. Guess what? No, we don't. And one of the examples was how I failed as a listener and survived miraculously, or a bad listener, and we moved that way. So we had the topics winnowed in that way, and these 7 are quite powerful, and they're the necessary things. If you aren't at threshold for every one of these, you're going to eventually get in some trouble. So that's my version of how we got these 7.
Yeah, and I'll just add, one of the frameworks that we put on the sort of initial whiteboarding that we did to frame up the book was around the concept of ROI. Like, if you want to become a better leader, and you're going to invest time and energy in doing that, where are you going to get the greatest return on that energy? Where are you going to see the biggest impacts? Because as we all know about the leadership field, there is a kind of more is more, more is better bias, right? If you're trying to evolve as a leader, like, here are the 50 things you should remember this week, and here's another 50 for next week. And so we really tried to simplify it and say, these are the 7 things. If you work on them, there will be a marked improvement in your ability to lead people. And secondly, just to kind of ideally create a shared language around leadership. Because one of the things we find in big enterprise companies is that there's often like different languages of leadership for people at different levels of the company. And so you have those sort of development offsites, and then you go back to work and it's not really part of the everyday conversation. So that was another one of our goals. It's like, if we start at the top and understand the role of the CEO and his or her leadership team and everybody below them through the organization, and frame up the 7 things that are part of everybody's job every day, then ultimately we thought we could help advance the conversation around leadership.
Mhm. Yeah, I was really persuaded. Well, I was persuaded really by all 7, but the one that really grabbed me was right there up front in chapter 1, where you all talk about the importance and really how the top leaders today have this superpower of being able to simplify complexity, particularly trying to build a simple plan for a strategy of an organization. Now, for somebody who's living in the eye of the storm and has a million things going on all at once, this can sound like a pretty gross oversimplification. What are you talking about? Simple. This is a very complex situation. So can you talk a little bit more about that, the notion of simplifying complexity and how that's a superpower that leaders today really need to acquire?
Sure, and I'll start off. I mean, there is a fine line. You sort of touched on your question. There's such a fine line between simplifying complexity and oversimplifying complexity. But if I think about the hundreds and hundreds of leaders that I've interviewed, and what is the through line? What help explains why they've achieved this level of success? A lot of it goes back to this skill, this habit of mind of simplifying complexity. To take everything that's going on in the company, in the industry, and to be able to distill it down into something where they can stand up in front, at an all hands meeting and essentially answer the kinds of questions that little kids ask in the back seat, right? Like, where are we going? How are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? And there is this art form of being able to do it. I mean, there are plenty of examples. Kevin is one of the highest practitioners of the art that I've met. People like Bob Iger at Disney and the way he sort of set up the strategy of the company. And it is this balancing act. Like, you can't make it so simple that it doesn't create a kind of shared compass of where you're going. But ultimately, that is the leader's job. And, as we were writing this book, we started before the pandemic started. And then as we went into the crisis, Kevin and I were always sort of sense checking ourselves, like, are these things just as true in the pandemic? And, you can discount for home team bias, but I think if you look at the 7 tests, they have only been magnified and grown in importance in this crisis. And it does start with this notion of like, what is our strategy? Yes, we're going to have to adjust because of the inevitable disruption, but let's all have a shared understanding of what the plan is.
Simplifying complexity is one of the most complicated things that a leader is asked to do. Debbie, as you rightly point out, you can imagine being a CEO and 100 tennis balls are coming at you simultaneously. You're trying to figure out which one to hit. The other thing about simplifying complexity that's powerful is it's a great communication tool, because what you want to do is get the entire organization aligned around the big idea. What are we trying to do here? And fundamentally, how are we going to do it? How are we going to measure success? What's good look like? And what is your role in doing that? And when leaders don't have a simple plan, what ends up happening is these endless lists of priorities. Nobody knows how they fit together. Nobody knows what we're really trying to do. And virtually none of those leaders ever really succeed in lifting their companies or organizations to the next level. And simplifying complexity isn't just about the strategy, it's about virtually everything. You always have more facts than you really know how to deal with, and you're trying to net out the answer to the big question. Okay, all that's true, so what? What are we going to do about it? Who's going to do what when? How are we going to know what good is going to look like? And in my consulting work, which I'm privileged to be able to do now with some pretty big enterprise CEOs, this is consistently something we work on. Okay, things are really, really complicated. What's the big idea? And smart people can really simplify complexity people who maybe aren't that smart tend to make complexity even more complex as a way to show supposedly how smart they are, but it has the reverse effect.
And I'll just jump in one quick note. I mean, the first sentence of the first chapter is quoting Kevin saying, "What's the big idea and so what?" which he uses to sort of challenge people on his team and the people he works with. And once, once I got this insight from Kevin, I mean, you sort of see it everywhere as you kind of observe leaders. You think of Mary Barra at GM. It's like, hey, Mary, what's the big idea? Well, we're going to go to electric vehicles by 2035. Hey, Joe Biden, what's the big idea? We're going to get everybody vaccinated so they can hang out with their families on July 4th. There's that kind of, simplicity, singularity of goal that galvanizes everybody and rallies them to make it happen.
And it's kind of Debbie, it's kind of risky because as a leader, you're sort of naked, because if you look at the president, we're going to get everybody vaccinated by day X and blah, blah, blah. He's kind of hanging out there that if it doesn't happen, he's on the hook. So simplifying complexity takes some courage too, because there are implications about how clear you are about the plan.
Right, right. All right, well, let's say you successfully, as the CEO or the leader of your team, you're able to come up with that relatively simple idea to get to that simplification for your strategy. But of course, nobody's an island unto herself or himself. Everybody needs a team. And you talk a lot, you have a whole chapter on high performing teams, the importance of high performing teams. Can you give us some tips on or some insights about building such teams to get to that high performance level?
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. If somebody said to me, Kevin, give a CEO one idea, you only got one idea. And I would say there is no substitute for the best team, no substitute. And so what's that mean? How do you do it? We tried to put it in the book, how to do it. But the first thing is you have to have real clarity on what you expect leaders to do. What do leaders do? Next thing you have to have is people who've got the capability to grow. Next thing is that they have to be people who've got a shared reality and what the current situation is. They've got to have alignment on what we're going to do next and how we're going to measure it. They've got to trust each other. There's got to be psychological safety. The CEO job to me is a lot like being an orchestra conductor. You're not playing the instruments, you're conducting, you're picking the music, you're picking the musicians, but you've got to help those team members be able to do the best job they can possibly do. And so this task is probably half of the time a CEO spends day to day is trying to get this team to perform at the highest possible level. It is an art form. It is not easy, but no company's better than the top team.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, that one of the things that I've learned as I'm starting to get some gray hairs is like the simplest questions in business are often the hardest, right? Like, what is your strategy? And in the context of teams, the difficult question sometimes is, why are you a team? And that may seem obvious, right? We're a team because we're a team, and all companies have leadership teams. But when we're working with leadership teams, we often press on that question because there really is only one right answer to the question, why are you a team, which is to accomplish things that you can only accomplish together as a team, because there are too many leadership team meetings that kind of devolve into just report outs to the CEO. Everybody takes their turn while everybody's glancing at their phones under the table. And there's not that kind of like shared agenda of what do we need our collective power, the big goals that we need to achieve for the company overall. So that's one point. The other thing that we go pretty deep on in that chapter is this idea of almost creating like a social contract on the team, setting clear guidelines on norms and behaviors, or what people can expect from each other. Because, I often make the joke that there's a reason HBO ran Game of Thrones on Sunday night, which is to get people ready for work on Monday morning, right? Because there's just too many leadership teams that operate with that sort of zero-sum mentality. If I'm going to win, I'm going to have to take you down, because if the leader is creating that environment where everybody's fighting for resources and attention, that's what you have. So you almost as a leader have to create an incredibly powerful counterweight to battle those kind of human instincts that are so well captured in Game of Thrones.
And And I would just add that, if Debbie, if I could have one test for a team, it would be, how does that team make and implement decisions? That process will tell you almost everything you need to know about their capability, the degree to which they trust each other, the degree to which they actually follow through and support the decision, et cetera. So it's a high art, and it is too often a Game of Thrones.
Well, that's a great segue, I guess, into my next comment / question. And that is that you two obviously are a high performing team, right? Because like you said, writing a book is very hard work, and yet you did a great job. So let's talk about, what was your process for winnowing down what could have been 27 lessons learned. You winnowed it down to 7. How did you do it? How long did it take you to write the book? And if you could be any character in the Game of Thrones, who would each of you be?
I may dodge that last question. So one of the things that guided us in the winnowing process, pretty early on, we adopted this metaphor of Russian nesting dolls. And as we were going through our list, we were always asking ourselves, like, what idea sort of nests inside another idea, right? And that was really helpful to get that list down to 7. Kevin and I were sort of remarkably aligned on, pretty much everything as we went through the process. We were clear about our respective roles. I mean, I was the guy with fingertips on keyboard most of the time, but I would interview, once we framed up a particular test or chapter, I would interview Kevin for hours to get his insights and stories, and then I would compare those against mine. So that was sort of the process. And it was pretty smooth. I will say that, if there's one speed bump during the process, Kevin and I didn't see eye to eye on everything. I will say early on, I came into the chapter on culture with a pretty fixed idea in my head. I had this bias about the values exercise that most companies go through. And, it was kind of my belief that the list should be pretty short enough to remember, so people could remember them. And also the words and phrases had to be incredibly specific. And over time, Kevin very patiently would ask questions like, you think so? Can we talk about this a little more? And he ultimately won me over to the idea that, I don't want to sound like I'm exaggerating this point, but ultimately, it doesn't really matter how long the list is or what the words are. What matters is that when you start, double and triple clicking on those things, that there's clarity about what those mean, what the specific behaviors are underneath them, that there are clear guardrails that are reinforced in every turn. So ultimately, we saw eye to eye on that, but again, it started with just this sort of sense from the get-go that we were going to check our egos at the door. It wasn't about who's right. It's ultimately about what's right.
And the other thing I'd add to what Adam said is, this book, like all books, went through iterations. We sent it out to some readers, 5 or 6 people we trusted and respected. And the first version got some pretty strong reaction, like, hey, this needs to be fixed, this needs to be added, this needs to be trimmed. And so those readers, as they always do for authors, were really, really valuable in helping us turn the first draft into something that was tighter and better, and quite a bit better. So you gotta trust people who aren't intimately involved to give you their best reaction too.
Right. By the way, you can give it some thought and get back to me later on the Game of Thrones, but here's a hint. Choosing to be Jon Snow would be good. Being a White Walker, not so much. So I'd stay away from that as you think that through.
Yeah, I did have an answer to that question. I only watched a little bit of it. The really good guy who unfortunately got his head chopped off pretty early. I'd want to be that guy, but not get my head chopped off.
I think that was in the first season, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I will also confess, I was one of those annoying parents who was always turning to their kids and going, who's that guy? Who's that? Wait, who's that? What's the relationship?
It did get a little confusing. They did not make it simple, right? They didn't quite get that strategy down to the simplification element.
I started to think everybody was Jon Snow after a while.
Yeah. The other chapter I really loved was maybe the summation chapter. It was the final chapter, Mastering the Inner Game of Leadership. So can you tell us, what does that mean exactly? And what are some tips for how to actually do it?
That Debbie was one of the chapters that our first readers suggested we add. And one of the first things that Adam and I hit upon as we started to conceptually talk about the job is that there are a lot of paradoxes in this job. You're kind of supposed to be, Superman or Superwoman, yet you're not. Or you're supposed to be highly, highly confident, but you got to be humble too. And so this sort of set of paradoxes needs to be managed, and this job will eat you up. And it'll eat you up because it'll take all your time. You can feel under pressure all the time. You're criticized all the time. And so to sort of have the ability inside to deal with this and realize fundamentally, this isn't about you. It's about the results of the enterprise that you're privileged to lead and be able to handle that. So the mastery of the inner game is, I think, a place that a lot of CEOs really struggle. And when CEOs get in trouble, inevitably there's some lost balance, lost perspective, became arrogant, didn't listen. And so I'm glad you pointed that chapter out as centrally important. It is. It's not easy.
And I'll just add, a key framing point, we had 7 chapters, and the first 6 are really about what a leader does. It's kind of the day-to-day, this is how to do the job. And that last chapter about the inner game is how you need to be as a leader. And as Kevin said, sort of all these balancing acts and how to quiet, in some ways, all the noise in your head, because there's so much leadership advice out there. And at some level, almost all of it is contradictory if you listened to it enough. One of the things that I've been struck over the dozen years I've been interviewing CEOs, almost all of those interviews have been in person. I really believe that sort of eye contact is sort of the 5G of communication. And there's just this look that you can see in leaders' eyes, and the best ones, they're calm, they're confident, they're credible. And I've always wondered, where does that come from? And just that sort of sense of that inner balance, even though they're getting at every minute hit by like 1,000 things from 100 different angles, to just stay centered. And so I was always intrigued by that. And the chapter on the inner game is really our best answer on, well, how do you do that in practice?
And I think, Debbie, the great leaders inevitably start out with, I've got to prove that I'm worthy of this job. We got to put some points on the board. We got to make the changes. But as the journey happens, you realize you're really in service to the enterprise. You're a temporary custodian, and your real obligation is to make that enterprise better than you inherited it, and have your successor be able to carry on and continue and hopefully be better than you were. So you shift from this personal focus, I got to put some points on the board, to I'm really in service to this enterprise, the people who work here, and the customers we serve. Not everybody makes that journey, but if you can, it's the right one.
Right. Okay, let me get a little controversial here, put you on the spot. So we've got these 7 challenges, and both of you have studied leadership for a long time. You kept abreast of the leaders of today and leaders from yesterday. So give me 1 or 2 that you think really have nailed it, that they have overcome these challenges, that they're exhibiting these behaviors, that they've mastered the inner game of leadership. And I'll give you a bonus point if you give me a leader or 2 who hasn't. Provided we can publish it in the Washington Post tomorrow morning. No, just kidding about that.
There you go. Those are good questions, Debbie. May I give them a quarter turn to answer it in the way that I'd like. The first question about who have we met who has kind of mastered this. And when I reflect on all the leaders that I've interviewed over the years, I mean, when I started on this kind of leadership journey of what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them a single question about their companies and just asked them about their leadership lessons, I didn't know what to expect, right? But over the years, what I've become so intrigued by is that the ones who do seem calm, confident, and credible have figured out the puzzle for themselves. And it's not, they figured it out in a way that makes sense of the world around them, but also for their internal values, like who you are as a leader. I mean, people talk a lot about authenticity, but everybody brings their own approach to it, and they construct this almost this framework that makes sense of, okay, my personal values as a leader, how I've noticed that what makes cultures operate effectively or not, and then how do you drive strategy in the industry you're operating in. And what I've just found interesting is just like, there are so many approaches to it. I mean, maybe if you'll indulge a mountain metaphor, it's like, everybody's trying to get to the top, but there's kind of an infinite number of paths to get there. And that's what I've been so intrigued by. In terms of bad leaders, I mean, unfortunately, there's too many examples out there. So rather than chewing up time, over to you, Kevin.
Matt, I'll take it on as direct. There are many. First of all, this is an incredibly challenging job, incredible, and I have great respect for anybody who takes it on. I think in today's world, Larry Culp at GE personifies great leadership in many ways. He does have a clear idea of what he's trying to do. It's not about him. He is delivering with his team on the commitments that he's made. He is bringing GE to a much, much better place. Shareholders are benefiting. He takes dramatic action. So I'd put Larry just top of mind as one of the people today who exemplifies what great leadership looks like. And he's in a rescue kind of a company. I think Tim Cook, who could ever have thought that the person who succeeded Steve Jobs would do the kind of job Tim has done. I don't know Tim, but I sure know what he's done with his company, and it's been truly extraordinary. And I could go on to others. You can pick any leader who was removed by the board in a difficult situation as a candidate for somebody who just didn't make it. And there's lots of reasons that can happen. The challenge the leader got could be overwhelming. It could be a crisis that just they couldn't get through. Maybe nobody could get through. It could be that there was some activist set of investors who just said, look, not good enough, and they got their way. There's lots of ways to hit the wall in this job. And it can happen to anybody. It almost happened to me. It didn't, but I got a note from one of our former board members said, hey, it looks like you survived. I wasn't sure you were gonna. So I don't want to be arrogant about this. It's a hard job.
And there are ups and downs. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was a business reporter at the New York Times in the 1990s was, the more I looked at CEOs in different industries, it dawned on me that society in many ways sees, stock performance as a proxy for the CEO's IQ, right? Like if the stock is going up, the CEO is brilliant. If it's falling, they're not so smart. And I just don't think that's realistic. I mean, over a long career, and Kevin has his own stories to share. I mean, there are going to be ups and downs, right? And I think a key question is like, do you learn from them? And that it's one of the things that I find is so unique about the CEO's role is that just in terms of like the feedback loop that you get from life and experience is so intense as a CEO that if you're looking for the patterns, you can learn very quickly because you can observe individuals in high stress situations, whether they're performing, why are they performing? You can do that with teams, divisions. And so there's just this incredible richness of experience that if the towel, the metaphor I think of is almost like a wet towel, like, of experience. Like, do you wring that towel and get every drop of insight from that experience? And if you do that, I mean, in many ways, like the learning curve can be very steep over time.
Well, you just talked about, I think, probably all the reasons you said plus more explain why the average tenure of a CEO these days is only about 5 years, which is not very long when you consider some of the big cultural changes, the big changes that companies are going through. So that's a challenge in and of itself, too much churn in the C-suite. The other thing, I think is an interesting line of inquiry is that we're in this era of these unicorns and billionaires being in first-time CEO gigs. They have the great idea, they have the charisma to sort of get the company to a certain level, but then they handle it differently when it comes to scaling up different levels of success. Is there any lessons to be learned here in those instances?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of entrepreneurs over the years. And one of the things that struck me is that it is a pretty small club of the, proverbial CEO who, starts the company in his or her basement, right? And grows it from one employee, ultimately 2,000 of employees, taking it public. That is an incredibly small club. And when I've interviewed those CEOs, I've always been intrigued, like, how did you stay one step ahead of where the company needed to be? Because the more predictable narrative is that the founder CEO takes it to a certain spot and then kind of taps out, right? And then the investors say, well, we need to bring in a professional CEO to sort of take it to the next level. And I'm so intrigued when I meet somebody who can do that themselves. And I always ask, like, how did you do that? And it's just, they reach out. It's like all the things that maybe you'd expect, right? They have a network, the sort of personal board of directors beyond the investor board of directors, just people, this mindset of constantly learning. And just endless curiosity and reflection. Because I do think, this whole idea of reflection, I mean, we're so busy and maybe we've slowed down a bit during the pandemic, but just having quiet time to sort of, again, reflect on the experience you've just had, what can be learned from it so that when you do this again, you're going to do it better. And it to me, it's such an interesting mindset. And those people are fascinating case studies to me.
Debbie, I'd say it's a simple concept, hard to do. The people who can grow with the company have to change themselves. What worked when you had 10 employees is not going to work when you got 1,000. So you have to have the insight to say, this is core, this is not going to change, but I have got to grow. I've got to grow myself. How do I lead a company when I don't know everybody, et cetera? It's no surprise that it's rare that somebody can do that, but some people can, but not most. Got it.
Okay, I want to turn to some questions that our audience submitted for you two gentlemen. The first is that research shows that many CEOs are not visionaries. In fact, it's rather rare to be a visionary. In your opinion, what role does vision play in CEO success? And do you see that leading a firm towards a shared vision, is that a really crucial skill for CEOs to master?
When I think of the word vision, I go back to sort of Kevin's provocation of what's the big idea and so what, right? And when you think of visionary CEOs, you tend to think of people like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, and each of them had a big idea, right? And Steve Jobs, like technology that is focused on the consumer and making it simple and elegant and intuitive, and Jeff Bezos, like the everything store, right? And so you can call that a vision, but ultimately it's sort of, they had a simple plan. They had the big idea. And a lot of people tend to put people like them on a pedestal and say, okay, well, they're visionaries. But to me, it shouldn't be this idea that they're out of reach or somehow, most people can't be like them. I do think if there is this discipline, if you're in any leadership position, to always be creating this forcing function for yourself of asking and answering Kevin's question. It was like, what is the big idea? And so what? And then how do you make that happen? And what are the challenges? And how do you measure progress? And to me, ultimately, that's what vision means.
Yeah, I think vision is central, but often when the term is used in the popular press, it sort of gets mixed up with things like charisma, massive risk-taking, gigantic arrogance on the part of the CEO, et cetera. That's not what I think of when I think of vision. I think about, we have got to make this company better because the world's going to demand more from us. Our competitors will get better. So how do we get better at executing the big idea, and what is the big idea? And so to a degree, if you're not a visionary in that regard, you will fail in your principal job as CEO of making the enterprise better.
What role does humility play in exceptional leadership? You mentioned arrogance, so let's now go with humility. Is that absolutely essential?
You wouldn't. Short answer, yes. And you will become humble if you're not. Circumstance will make you humble is my experience and my observation. And humility is not lack of confidence. Humility is not false. It's knowing what you don't know, realizing all of us are smarter than any one of us, listening carefully, asking questions, understanding risk, enlisting allies. Humility says it's not about me, and I can't do it all myself, and I'm not the smartest person in the world, and I need a good team, and I've got to listen and take care. It doesn't mean lack of courage. It doesn't mean that, but it means, hey, it's not all about me. I need to listen. What's the team think? It's those kind of behaviors.
And I'll just add, I mean, we've been through such a remarkable period over the past year, and I often reflect on how leadership has sort of evolved and changed in some ways. To me, permanently, I will make the argument that command and control leadership is officially dead. You know, any leader who sits at the head of the table and pretends that they've got the answers is going to lose credibility instantly, because, you know, the disruption that we've all been living through, I think there's going to be some degree of it for, you know, pretty much ever. And so leaders have to have the humility that, to me, is captured in that expression, the smartest person in the room is the room. Just this idea of collectively, we will figure out the answers. And to me, that's an important manifestation of humility.
Right. And that kind of goes back to a theme that we've talked about periodically. You devote a whole chapter to this question of listening. We think we're good listeners, but not so fast. So what are some practical tips that we can implement to work on our listening skills?
Kevin, you've got such great stories behind this. Over to you.
I think, Debbie, the first thing is to realize we're not as good a listener as we think. Probably the single biggest aha moment I had in my journey was hearing Sam Palmisano, who was talking to our leadership group. He was then CEO of IBM. Somebody said, "Hey, Sam, you spent a couple of years in Japan. What did you learn there?" And Sam said, "You know something? I learned to listen like the Japanese people listen. I listened for comprehension. I didn't listen to try to convince them something else, or to make my next argument, or to think about what I'm doing this weekend, or 8 tracks. I just want to understand what they think and why they think that." And in a sense, that's the highest form of respect you can give somebody. I really want to know why you think what you think. I may not ultimately agree with you, but my first objective is that. The second thing I would say is, for the CEO at least, and for any senior leader, you have to realize you have to create your own, what we call, listening ecosystem. That is, you know, as a CEO, you get incomplete information, you get information that's biased to be positive, and you get information that's relatively narrow. One of the things I used to tell my students at school was, the best thing I can think about the CEO job is you're in the jungle, you don't have many clothes on, you got a knife, and everybody wants to kill you. So you better know if that rustling thing in the distance is a branch rustling, or it's some leopard that's about ready to jump on you, which means you've got to have extended listening, you got to have broad listening. So it's both in the moment and the system you create. And you've got to be aggressive in listening. You can't be passive. You can't say, well, no news is good news. It's a fascinatingly complex topic, but something, if you can master as a leader, it'll stand you in such good stead. I can't say enough about it in support of the idea.
One of my favorite expressions about leadership is, as you move up, be careful how funny your jokes become, right? And anybody who sat in a few meetings has seen this movie, right? Where the boss tells a so funny joke and everybody, you go around the table, they're sort of laughing at them like they're Dave Chappelle. And, just having that self-awareness that you are kind of trapped in a bubble and that people are, massaging information. They just want to bring you good news. Everything's great, boss. Oh, everything's perfect. And then sort of step one is to recognize you're in that bubble. And step two is, as Kevin says, be incredibly intentional about building that listening ecosystem so that you know what's actually going on in the organization, not just what you think is going on based on all the smiling faces you see throughout the day.
Debbie, I just want to make one other point to what I said. I'm not suggesting you should be suspicious that people are lying to you. That can happen, of course. But what you really want to do is make people comfortable to tell you what they really think and what concerns they might have, what ideas they have. It's a lot about setting the psychological table so people can believe you really do want to hear what they have to say.
Right, right. And I just wanted to follow up on something what Adam said, the analogy of the leader with the funny jokes, except they're not really that funny. Adam, was that your subtle way of saying that Kevin isn't nearly as funny as he thinks he is? That's the way I was taking it. I was listening very carefully, and that was my interpretation.
I've kicked Kevin in the shins enough time. He's got some bruises. So, it's so interesting, this idea of be careful how funny your jokes become, because I always look for kind of leadership moments in TV shows and movies. And there's this incredible scene in the Sopranos in the 5th season where, Tony is separated from his wife, Carmela, but she tells him, like, look, you're not as funny as you think you are. Like, all your flunkies laugh at you because they work for you. They're not your friends. And he sort of pushes back, and then cut to later in the episode, and he's playing poker with his crew, and he decides to tell an intentionally unfunny joke to test Carmela's theory. So he says, like, what do you get when you mix an accountant with a big jet airplane? A boring 747. And at that point, the camera does this slow pan around the table, and everybody's just sort of laughing at Tony. And the beautiful moment of the scene is the camera goes back to Tony's face, and he does this slow blink of recognition that Carmela was right. So I think about that scene so often in leadership contexts.
Yeah, yeah. Now, here's another question. What role, if any, do you feel executive development can play in preparing potential CEOs for the leadership tests that you talk about in your book?
It's perfect softball down the middle. So I'll answer it this way, that the way I think about it is that if somebody becomes a manager at, say, let's say age 35, and then they're a manager and leader for the next 30 years, right? What we know is inevitable is that they will learn some lessons and gain some insights just based on their own experience, their trial and error, whether they recognize patterns. So over those 30 years, it's going to take them some time, but they are going to learn some key lessons about leadership. So I think what Kevin and I are trying to contribute here ultimately is, how do you shorten that learning curve? Right? How do you speed up some, based on the stories, the insights, the tips, tools, takeaways, frameworks, approaches that we provide in this book? How, for those emerging leaders, wherever you are in that sort of leadership journey, how can you get there faster to those core insights so you be more effective? And to me, like, to Kevin's question, like, what's the big idea? Like, that's the big idea.
And I think too, Debbie, that there are people who work in the function of executive development and try to help other leaders develop leaders, and that function can be very significant or not very significant at all, depending on how the senior leaders use it. And the questions I would ask are things like, what exactly do we expect leaders to do? How often do we assess how the leaders we're trying to help are doing, both from our own observation, but probably more importantly from the observation of the people who work for them or around them? Do those leaders have true self-awareness? Do those leaders really want to improve? Or do they say, look, I know I'm not very good at this thing, but I'm so good at this other thing, that doesn't matter? Do they really want to grow? So executive development can be very helpful if they've got CEO support, if the standards are clear, if the information gathered is comprehensive and accurate, and the individual themselves really want to grow. And then strategically, are they going to move those people into jobs that are outside their comfort zone to see how they can handle a new challenge? It's no mystery why so few companies, when it comes time to pick the next CEO, have very few choices, and sometimes maybe only one choice or no choice. It's because it's so hard to develop somebody to be ready for this job.
Right, right. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And so here it comes. All three of us are mentors within Merrick, and certainly we've all tried to learn and we've studied, particularly over this last year, matters concerning racial and gender equity. So the question is, the 7 challenges that you talked about in the book, do women leaders and those who are of color, do they face the same 7 challenges? Are there any additional challenges, or are they any different tips to overcome leadership challenges that you might offer to women or people of color?
I'm happy to take the first run at that. I think the 7 challenges that we identify in the book are universal, but I've interviewed a lot of women and people of color over the years, and I think it's fair to say that women and people of color face tremendous headwinds in the workplace, and those headwinds are manifested in a lot of different ways and create extra challenges, and require a lot of tailwinds to get through them and specific approaches. And we could talk for hours about that, but I do think there are sort of extra challenges for those leaders. They can be overcome, and I think a lot of companies are having discussions about trying to make those headwinds go away or die down. I think we need to recognize they'll probably always be with us to some degree, but they represent an extra leadership challenge for sure.
Debbie, I'm glad that you asked us that question. I think it may be the question of the day. And I agree completely with what Adam said. I think maybe a comment of some hope is I think an awareness of this fact has never been greater. Now, can we translate that awareness into actions that actually address the issues? And I think it's going to, first of all, take an awareness on the part of the power structure, which is more white male than anything else. Do they really understand the challenges, and will they really do things to help? That said, these 7 challenges will be threshold challenges for all leaders. And so these challenges or tests we have in the book will still apply, but I'm more hopeful now than I've ever been that we're going to be able to make some progress. Won't be easy, won't be fast, but I think the time's right, and I'd be optimistic.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the CEO test, Adam Bryant and Kevin Sharer. Thank you so much for your participation today. And now let me turn the microphone back to David Reimer.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Kevin. It's been a great discussion, and I know there will be more coming out of this. So really appreciate all your contributions. Thanks, everybody.